Hi, welcome everyone to this presentation by Maria Alejandra Velez called Coca-Based Local Growth and its Economic and Socio-Environmental Impact in Colombia. Maria Alejandra is a professor at the Faculty of Economics at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. She's the director of the Center for Studies for Security and Drugs in the same university and is currently the clinical visiting professor at ILAS. Her research work focuses on governance and institutional design for natural resource management in rural communities of the Global South and on the interaction between drug and environmental policies. She is going to present, and then there will be two commentators. The commentators are Enrique Desmond Arias, who is the Marx Chair in Western Hemispheric Affairs at City University of New York, who works on security and politics in Latin America and the Caribbean, and is the author of Criminal Enterprises and Governance in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Drugs and Democracy in Rio de Janeiro, Trafficking, Social Networks, and Public Security. He's also served as consultant to many institutions and has authored introductory handbook on policing in urban spaces. And finally, we have our own Mauricio Cardenas, who's a professor professional practice in global leadership in the Faculty of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He's also affiliated with the Global Energy Policy Center, and he has a vast academic and policymaking experience. Most notably, he was Colombian finance minister between 2012 and 2018. And additionally, he held other 4 ministries: economic development, transport, planning, and mines and energy. Minister. I'm very impressed, and the floor is yours.
Look how Colombia.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Vicky and ILAS and Romina for organizing this seminar and for actually hosting me this semester. And also thank you, Desmond and Mauricio, for accepting to this paper. I'm sure that with your different backgrounds, we're going to have a very interesting discussion. So I'm going to present this paper, but before the paper, really because of the audience and also because I think that the context in this case is really, really important, I maybe want to spend a little bit, in the introduction a little bit longer than usual, because I think we need to cover some of the basics about this market before entering into the impact. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the key facts about coca and cocaine, a little bit about coca in Colombia, where it's located, who are the coca growers and why coca, and then we will really talk about the paper. But you will see that I think this introduction is, I think, very important to understand the context. So let me start by some key facts about the market that I think is very important to understand. We have 23 million of cocaine consumers worldwide. It's a very stable market, actually growing in Europe, growing in Asia, growing in and in the States. In the United States, despite the fact of the new drugs, synthetic drugs, it's a very stable market. Colombia produces almost 70% of the total cocaine market, and the other producing countries are Bolivia and Peru. And overall, I will start by this. The drug policy has really failed to accomplish the objectives of reducing consumption and production. And in fact, the drug policy has been disproportionately paid. The cost of drug policy has been disproportionately paid by vulnerable population in consumer and producer. Coca, of course, has a long-standing cultural and functional value in the Amazon region. Communities in the Andes and the Amazon region have used coca for cultural and spiritual roles, and that's a very important element. However, here today, we're not going to talk about coca for the cultural uses. We're going to talk about the coca for cocaine production. It's important to mention that cocaine is just one of the 10 alkaloids that are found in coca leaves. And in order to get cocaine, there's a lot of process and steps and actors that participate in each of these steps. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but I just wanted to point out that we are really going to be talking here about the first steps of this value change, where people cultivate the coca crops, harvest the coca crops, and maybe produce Coca-Based. And what I'm going to show is the impact of that economy on Colombia. in the regions of Colombia. It's important to mention that the value or the harvest coca of the coca leaves represent only 8% of the aggregated value that is generating the contribution of that change of Colombia. More than 85% of the cocaine value is created outside of the region. And it's estimated that coca crops represent only 1% of the value of the cocaine production chain. However, I want to show you that 1% for the regions in Colombia is very, very important and very difficult to think about other sectors that can capture that. So how much coca crops are right now in Colombia and where are they located? Right now, I mean, the last figure that it was actually just informed a couple of weeks ago is 253,000 of hectares of coca that recognize coca crop in the country. And I'm gonna focus in this particular period of time after the peace process when you see this amazing increase of coca crops. This is the latest coca boom, as we call it, and we're gonna talk about the impacts of that coca boom. Coca crops in the last 10 years have been basically located in the same territories. Once coca enters, it's difficult to leave. And basically, in the last couple of years, you can see that the identification of coca, it's moving to the frontiers, although keeping the same territories. In my particular case, how I started on work on this is because 60% of the coca crops are located in the environmental sensitive areas, national parks, Afro-Colombian communities, indigenous reservoirs, and forest reserves. And this is important part of the story because any policy that you can think about here is going to have an impact on the forest as well. So who are the coca growers? How many? Nobody knows how many. It's amazing, but we don't know how many coca growers are involved in this. The latest estimation is that we have approximately, the latest official estimation by the United Nations, they say that it's around 169,000 families who harvest coca. The estimates, even the latest data, is that we're talking about 140,000 peasants, families that are directly involved in the coca harvest. But we also have the collectors, raspachines, as we call it there, and there are like five or five people per hectare. So you can imagine that this number is much higher. I'm going to talk quickly about some information about those families. In particular, the aggregated data that we have is that from these families that participated in the substitution program, so that's the information that we have so far. One important the thing to mention is the average size of the coca plot in 2018 was estimated in 1.07 hectares, and those entering the substitution program 0.5 hectares, and that's pretty small compared to the national average of 5 hectares for those who live in the property. So of course, it's an illegal crop. We're talking about the small plots. 60% of cocaleros claim to own the land, but only 12% have full formal property rights. According to the United Nations, 55% of cocaleros only harvest the coca, and 44 growers actually process the coca to paste. Only 1% go all the way to cocaine base. That's why I was telling you, really, we're going to be estimating the impact of those first steps in the value chain. Of course, there is regional variation, but overall, that's the data. When people produce coca, it's not the only thing that they produce. When you ask them what are their main productive activities, 20% say coca, but others say cattle ranching, working in other areas, plantain, cacao, etc. So coca is just one of the other, agricultural portfolios. What we have measured is that 50% of households that were part of the substitution program were classified as having multidimensional poverty, and 57 of harvesters were identified as being in multidimensional poverty. So despite the benefit of the coca crop, people who cultivate the coca are not becoming rich, they're just basically surviving. However, even considering this sort of relative poverty, coca growers reinvest their income and experience on social mobility. So some of the surveys by my colleague Francisco Gutierrez in Universidad Nacional mentioned that people said that they invest their income in education, investment in their household, in their homes, etc. So basically they are experience some social mobility and some investment like any other middle class, rural class. Regarding the municipalities where they live, the infrastructure development in Coca territories is significantly lower, in average approximately 30% less of electric connections and access to routes, less access to routes, etc. So the coca growers live in municipalities with lower public food provision at the municipal level. So what are the advantages of coca leaf if they're still in poverty and they're still in municipalities without public services? Well, there is many advantages of the coca leaf. First, of course, that if you ask coca growers, they would say that it is the most profitable activity given the places where they live, 5, 2 hours, 3 hours, 7 hours from the next town. But more important, coca is really inserted in a global economy, which is not happening in other traditional crops. There is a guaranteed international market. There is price stability for both the coca leaf and the Coca-Based. There is basically zero or low transportation costs because people, mafia, art groups, etc., go to the farm to buy the coca leaves. Coca crops mainly employ family labor. The harvest itself leaves available time to be used in other activities. Coca serves as a way to access credit, but also it's a form of actual exchange mechanism in the absence of cash. People will pay the groceries with the Coca-Based. It's an amazing crop with 4 harvests per year. The first harvest in the first 6 months compared to cacao, which is the first 2 years. It has an average yield of 8,500 kilograms per hectare per year, increasing the productivity, and it has a very low production cost. So there's a lot of advantage of this crop, and very difficult to think what to replace that. But my point here, and the point that I'm going to make in the paper, and finally I'm getting into the paper, is that there is benefits beyond those directly benefits from the coca. So the repercussion of the coca economy extends beyond those directly involved in the economy, and it just transforms the territorial dynamics. So there is this comprehensive transformation, alters consumption, production patterns, and the behavior of those involved in the economy, but also the broader population. And there is sort of like a revolving door between licit and illicit economy. And you see these, t-shirts, sneakers, shoe shops in the middle of the jungle, basically, that shows that a lot of cash is low. So qualitative studies have, documented this for many years. I really like this quote from Maria Clara Torres. She said, 100 of houses, shops, and canteen houses, restaurants, clothing stores, warehouses, and agrochemical workshops are rose. You can see that a lot of money is circulating. Whenever you go to a cocalero town, people will always say, coca moved the entire economy this week. That's the phrase that everybody says. So we wanted to basically quantify that. How much? Did the coca boom after the peace process have an impact on regional economic activity? How big was it? Does the economic changes generated by the coca boom affect other productive and social dynamics? So we wanted to sort of quantify this quote here and how much is that the coca crops impact the economy beyond those directly involved with the economy. So this is the paper that I told you. I announced that the introduction was going to be a little bit longer, but I think it was important to introduce the topic. And this is the paper that I'm going to present. That is a work together with Lucas Marin, Manuel Fernandez, Eduardo Martinez, and Pablo Murillo. Some of them actually were the people who developed the data sets available to estimate the impact. So we are focusing in this later boom but I think this speaks about the impact of illicit economies in other periods. But we wanted to measure the impact of the coca boom after the peace process. So let me briefly tell you about the peace agreement and the peace process in Colombia for those of you who are not aware. Finally, after the longest conflict with the FARC, in 2016, the President Commander Santos and the FARC signed an agreement. And this peace process have a very comprehensive agenda, and one of the points of this agenda was the solution to illicit substances. Addressing the cocaine trade was, of course, very important part of the agenda, acknowledging its role in funding and fueling the conflict. So in 2014, both the government and the FARC announced the central part of this point, which was the National Program for the Substitution of Illicit Crops. And this announcement didn't have details regarding about the program, but it was an announcement that implied that there were going to be material benefits for those people in Cocalere region. There has been already a lot of papers showing the unintended consequences of that announcement. Basically, coca crops increased because of the announcement. People were expecting the benefits of that program. And that's something that has been even admitted by President Santos. He said the majority of the increase can be explained by, I must admit, perverse incentives driven by the announcement of the debt. So there is already sort of an agreement in the academic literature, but also in the public debate, that the announcement of this program increased the coca crops. So you can see in this graph that between the announcement and the first year substitution program, the area under coca cultivation increased by 150%, from 68,000 to 171,000 of hectares. So what we're going to do basically in this paper is to exploit this increase in the coca crops. And we are going to basically use the timing of the announcement and the probability of being in a municipality with higher probability of receiving the program. And we're going to compare the economic activity of those municipalities with a higher probability of receiving the program versus the economic activity of those that didn't receive the program. That's what we're going to compare. So from qualitative studies, we already know that illicit activities, of course, affect the state building, the state capacity, social interaction. We know that illegal income can reshape local economies with many sectors depending on these resources, as the quotes that I show you. But there is limited evidence quantifying how illicit production and trafficking impact that local economy, and that's our contribution. So the traditional literature in economics actually see illicit economies as an obstacle to social and economic progress. Traditional theories suggest that violence is inherent to illicit economies. But we also know from other sets of literature that these illicit activities are crucial for the survival of vulnerable populations and can stimulate economic activity in low-income regions. It's not that I'm promoting the illicit economies, it's just a fact that they're doing that. For some, coca crops are the only viable productive activity, and in fact, some people have estimated the impact of these illicit crops in the GDP of Afghanistan, and something like about 10%, in Myanmar, 15%, in Colombia, 2%, Laos, 3%. So the impact at the national level is huge. But of course, there is also another literature that is thinking about what is the income, the impact of these basically extractive goods, and if you have only short-term incomes, and you can think about also long-term income. So we also are sort of contributing to this literature about the short-term gain versus the long-run development of these income shocks. So as I said before, what we're gonna do is to sort of leverage this municipality level variation in coca production incentives triggered by the substitution program using an additional difference strategy. And given that we don't have municipal level gross domestic product data, we will use satellite-derived nighttime lights data as a proxy for economic activity. So there is a lot of studies that are using that already in the literature, and this is only for the case of Colombia. There are really a high correlation between GDP and lights. So our night time lights are our proxy of economic activity, and it's a very interesting set of data because it will capture formal, and most important in my case, informal economy. So, and then we look at other dynamics beyond economic activity, violent agricultural production and cattle ranching, deforestation, municipal tax revenues, and some other socioeconomic characteristics, migration, education level, labor market, and access to public service. Actually, these are the new data that is not in the version that you guys have, but that's what we did this couple of months, including the data. So here, given that we are in an interdisciplinary audience, I'm not going to go through the details of the empirical model, but let me explain you the intuition of our empirical model so you understand what we do. So first, what we are doing is to classify municipalities with the probability of receiving the substitution program. So basically, we are estimating the ex-ante probability of selection into the substitution program, because what we want to compare is municipalities with high probability of the substitution program against municipalities with low probability of receiving the substitution program, because we call that that's our instrument, because given that announcement, the coca crops increase. Then we are going to follow a different strategy to compare the nighttime lights before and after the announcement between those municipalities with high probability of substitution program and those municipalities with low substitution program. So that's the different bits. We're going to compare before and after in those two categories of municipalities. And of course, this allows us to quantify the differential effect of the substitution program announcement on the nighttime lights in the high probability municipalities relative to the low probability municipalities, and comparing the high probability municipalities against the low probability municipalities. We extend our difference framework to an instrumental variable, because also we want to express our data in terms of coca crops. And then we translate the effect into economic terms, and we approximate the impact of the local economic activity using the elasticity of departmental GDP. So we do have departmental GDP, and we have the nighttime lights, so we want to express those nighttime lights in economic terms. So let me quickly show you the main results, visually. This is exactly what I'm going to show with the regression, but these are visually what we are finding. In the pink side here are the high probability, the municipalities with high probability of receiving substitution program, and green are the low probability. And you can see, so just visually, that where there was a high probability of receiving the substitution program, you're going to see a higher change in the lights over the period, and that's what we are estimating. Also very descriptive. Again, red lines is the high probability of receiving the substitution program, and you can see that in those municipalities, the coca crops increase much more, of course, than in the low probability of receiving the substitution program. But more important, this is basically our result. You can see that in both municipalities, the night lights increase, but it increased much more in those municipalities where the coca crops increase. That's more formally is what our model show, is that in our preferred specification with geographic controls, the high probability municipality experience a substantial 60% increase annually in the nighttime lights post-announcement. That's huge. Like, you cannot imagine what other sector could do that. Visually, a municipality like Argelia, which was one of the municipalities that received this income shock by the coca, this is what the lights would look like before the announcement and after the announcement. So this is just capturing a new economic boom. The largest effects are observed in rural areas, but also we found the rural areas where the coca crops are located, but we also found these effects in populated areas and even in urban centers. So again, this is not the lights of the coca crops or the houses of the cocaleros. This is really the economic effect beyond those people who directly get it. Let me go quickly here. So we, as I said, we use the elasticity of the GDP and try to translate this lights in terms of GDP using the departmental GDP. And we estimated that the municipal level GDP increased between 2.8 and 10% in our preferred specification. Again, an increase of 3%. Let's put in the lower bound. 3% of a municipality GDP annually is huge in these regions. Then we look sort of at the mechanisms and other incomes. Violence. So what happens with violence? And this has generated a lot of impact in Colombia because what? the first thing is that we our results suggest that the effect of coca boom was larger in municipalities where there has been park presence. However, the effect also occurred for municipalities without park presence. So it occurs both scenarios. However, we did not find an increase, a differential increase in violence indicators. So this result have generated a lot of noise in Colombia because people are expecting that you will have an increase of violence in those municipalities that have the boom.
But you do come on social media.
Yes, we only finding that one, but I think this is attributed to the implementation of the pennies of the substitution program. Actually, we have other papers showing that this is happening after the implementation of the program. But the other things, it didn't occur, right? We didn't find any increase of disputes, unpresent number of groups, homicide rates. That's not saying that coca crops didn't increase other forms of violence, but these indicators did not change differentially compared to those with lower probability, at least in that period. We don't know if what we are suffering now is the consequence of that period. I don't know, but what we are testing is that in that period, the violence indicator did not increase. And there is a lot of literature that shows that these markets are not necessarily or inherited violence. Land use and deforestation, we did estimate that the deforestation rate increased 100%. Nonetheless, these results do not respond necessarily to crops directly. They could be explained by other economic activities. For example, we estimate that the coca boom increased the transformation of coca cultivation areas to pastures by 300%. But we didn't see an increase of cattle at the level. So we are seeing a lot of pastures, which suggests land grabbing type of activities, but without cows. Pastures for cows, but without cows. Tax revenues. I mean, you would expect that if you have an economic boom, taxes are going to increase, but if that's not the case, we didn't find positive effects on tax collection associated with industry, commerce, property tax, or fuel surcharge. This is obviously a bad or a negative result in the sense that it's not generating resources that could finance public goods in the long run. So these resources are saving the informal economy and it's not translating into formal tax. We also recently were able to estimate some other socioeconomic indicators. All the data that I showed before is at the panel level. With this one, we only have 2 moments in time, so it's not. We will not claim causality as strong as we did in the previous cases, but we have suggested evidence. We didn't find changes in population migration or access to public services, but we found increase in school attendance by 9%, literacy by 1.6%, increase to access in electricity, which makes sense, otherwise our other sort of and more interestingly, this effect of school attendance vary by age groups. We found that the boom increased attendance in children and teenagers up to 17 years old. However, it reduced the attendance in young adults over 20 because for them, of course, there's a higher cost for the cost of going to. We didn't find any gender effects. So just to wrap up, the result of this paper suggests a positive short term of the coca boom on economic activity as measured by nighttime lights. Oops. Yeah. We find that the incentives provided by the coca crop substitution program increased the nighttime lights by 60% each year. Overall, these effects translate to between a 2.5–3% increase in municipal GDP for each one standard deviation increase in coca crops. Our results are consistent across several robustness tests and occurring every area within the municipality, of course, but of course, as I mentioned before, the most important part of the effect is concentrated in the rural areas. Our results are not attributed to the implementation of the substitution program. Less than 1% of families by 2019 received all the benefits of the program, and less than 20% of the community projects were implemented. So these are not, both things happen after the peace process, and some people would think that this is attributed to that, but it's not that, it's the coca effect. So just to close, I will say that considering the magnitude of the estimated effects and the barriers for development in countries such as Colombia, it's very unlikely, at least in the short term, for other agricultural forestry sector to replace the regional economic benefit of illicit economy. Like we're trapped in this situation. Our results suggest null effects of an illicit economy in violence, as I said before, but it has a significantly effects that alter social and economic interaction. You know, this is in line with the study of the role of illicit economies on the state building and economic development, and it just emphasize that the study in this area should go beyond the perspective focused solely on violence, because much more things are happening around this sector. Illicit economies are promoting social and economic opportunities that formal institutions, legal institutions are not doing in those regions, but they are generating environmental damage. And I think that any attempt to intervene in those economies should start by acknowledging this role. Otherwise, any effort to change those markets can actually generate unintended consequences. And here, Desmond mentioned in the book. So with that, I think I will stop here. They have other things to do.
I don't have video, so.
Okay.
Why not? So I wanted to thank Maria Alejandra and Victoria for the invitation to be here. Happy to be here again. It's always wonderful to be part of these discussions. This paper is a wonderful example by the really important work that Colombians have done on conflict and illicit economies over the years. I mean, Colombia and Colombian scholars have been real global leaders in studying these issues seriously and concretely in ways that have been meaningful for the field in really important ways. And it's an honor to be asked to engage with you on this paper. So thank you. So a lot of the paper conforts with my experiences in Putumayo. I'm obviously not an economist. I'm one of the qualitative scholars, right, that you, not that you talk about there, but like, you know, who has a lot in line with the people that you're referencing there. When I was doing research in Putumayo, like a lot of these stories that you're telling about the positive effects of the coca-based economy on the region were really prominent and apparent, right? So I've talked to many peasants who said, you know, the coca economy drives here. We survive on the economy. I even talked to someone who went so far as to say, you know, here coca has replaced the state because it provides all the things the state can't provide to them. People spoke of how essential it was to their livelihoods, to their households, to their endeavors in the private sector, right? Not just about, you know, I'm growing coca and my household's surviving, but I'm also building my house, I'm extending my house, I'm acquiring new land, potentially to turn into pasture, though nobody who I spoke with actually was turning their land into pasture in 2019. People definitely talked about sending their kids to school. I met one older retired couple of cocaderos who had sent one of their children to an elite university in Bogota, and he had gotten a business degree, and he was now helping them in doing the FENIS program to transition to non-illicit crops. And they were investing in growing a certain type of nut that was down there, and he was flying off to Europe to market these products. So coca had paid for their kids to go to college. Their kid who had gone to college was helping them to further decrease their dependence on coca, right? So it was kind of a remarkable cycle there. But the older members of the family were terribly ashamed to talk about having been cocaderos, right? They were really kind of embarrassed to talk about this. In the interview with them, they also said, "Oh, you know, I mean, this was wrong what we did, you know, a bad thing." But, you know, we really had to do it for our family, but there was also a lot of fear, right? Not fear in terms of them talking about disengaging with the market, but fear about their experience with the market, the dangers of being involved in it, and the vicissitudes of it, and the way that affected them, right? The particular town that they were in southeastern Putumayo, right, which shows up as a big, bright red dot on that map that you showed. You know, you're talking about Colombia being you know, with 70% of global production. Like Putumayo itself has more production than either Peru or Bolivia, right? I mean, this is the scale of coca production in Putumayo, which is generally speaking one of the top 4 coca producing areas in Colombia, more than whole other countries. But the vicissitudes of that, the danger of that, really affect people, right? And so being engaged in the coca market, you know, had some marked effects on this family and a lot of the other people I talked about. Very positive effects in terms of how it affected their economies and the opportunities that were available for their children, but very negative effects on their self-perception and their general feelings of comfort. As one coca leader I spoke with said, "Es el momento que el campesino siembra coca, se vive una zozobra," right? That it's a constant anxiety from the moment that a peasant plants coca. I saw the photo you showed of like the strip mall in the town, and having been in those strip malls, they're actually not quite as nice in person. There is like all sorts of stuff to buy, but that was a particularly nice strip mall that you provided a photograph of. I had a few questions I wanted to pose. Nothing big, but stuff that I didn't quite get from the paper, which may be my own fault as a qualitative scholar who kind of struggles a little bit with these papers. But that I thought might be important to kind of think about and hadn't come through as clearly as I might have liked. One is how you're controlling for violence and the presence of multiple armed groups in these spaces during this period of time, right? In one sense, you say, hey, look, when PENIS happens, we get the coca boom, and we can also show that there's lower levels of violence. But of course, this is also happening concurrently with the FARC's demobilization in 2017. So you're taking the FARC out of the field, and you know that would presumably generate potentially less violence, right? You're removing an armed group from some of these spaces, and an armed group that's specifically engaged in a peace process with the state where they're trying to promote peace in the space, right? So that's one question in terms of like just general violence, but also I think that would be, you know, concurrent with school attendance, right? Because if you have more peace, it's easier for kids to actually get to school, right? They're not stuck in a particular in their vereda. They can travel up the river to go to school, you know, So school attendance would seem to also be connected potentially with that, as much as it might be connected to other factors that you're observing. And I'm wondering a little bit more, if you could talk a little bit more about how you disentangle those study. The other thing that I was, the FARC also encouraged adherence with the process, right? So the FARC actively, as part of the peace process, engaged in getting peasants to adhere to the peace. And I'm wondering kind of how you thought about that in your study. I guess one other piece that I noted from my own interviews was your strong correlation with the Fenice and the murder of social leaders. The social leaders were often being murdered because they were encouraging people to adhere to the Fenice, at least in Mayo, right? Because the gangs that were left running the drug trade in Mayo were discouraging people from adhering to the Fenice, right? So a lot of those social leaders were in fact being murdered, and they were being murdered because of their involvement. So those seem to be kind of deeply interrelated elements of this study that are entangled in pretty direct ways that are worth thinking about. I did find the finding that things didn't translate into formal taxes to be really interesting, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of how that connects to the Che and Alia paper, Che, Shapiro, and others who were observing that in places where you had paramilitaries present, there actually was a history of increased taxation because of the nature of land cadastration in those towns in the peace process, and the fact that in Mayo, of course, where a lot of the Fenices coming in are areas of former FARC power, where there's no real process of cadastration, right? So there are, I think, potential ways in there to think about intervening variables that are causing that interesting finding. I wanted to conclude with two kind of bigger theoretical observations that struck me. The first is this kind of theoretical distinction you make between kind of the violence approach and the economic growth approach to understanding coca growing and its impacts. And it seems that the violence approach, right, kind of this first one that you're critiquing is something that I'm not sure all the literature just says it leads to violence, right? You can have processes of less violence in some of these spaces without it necessarily leading to economic growth. I don't think that these two approaches, these two ways of thinking about it are actually so different, especially in terms of this last finding on tax. Because a lot of the question is, in terms of understanding economic growth and understanding tax collection and understanding the impacts of this growth, is who's benefiting from the growth, right? So there's this literature on kind of criminal organizations and how they run these spaces, right? And different things that they're doing, right? And how that could be potentially interfering with the function of the government, interfering with distribution of food, and promoting violence or promoting the cocaine trade or the coca trade in those particular spaces. Right, but what these groups can do, right, in addition to say administering coca fields, right, and administering these groups, is they can also arrange social relations in these spaces to extract resources, right? So the question is, when you get the coca boom, the cocaleros, they're going to benefit from the coca boom, right? They can increase their coca, production, they can make more money. But at least in the areas I was in Mayo, the criminal organizations impose a monopsony on the coca growers that forces them to sell at a below market rate, right? That's where they extract value, right? And it's really, you're talking about this 1 to 10% of the total value, because most of the value is actually being acquired moving the drugs out of the country. But on this margin that's available there, right? You have these groups threatening to kill people if they don't sell to their named buyer at a fixed price. And if you carry the drug into town, if you carry the face paste into town, right, you're putting your life at risk, right? So in these cases, who's really accumulating the money, right? To a certain extent, the coca grower accumulates some of the money. They're certainly doing better than if they're growing plátanos, but or chontaduro, right? But they're not making as much. They're not making the money that the buyers are. Right, so the capital is being accumulated by a fairly narrow set of people, even in these areas. So when I was driving around, people will say, "Look at all the pasture that's around here." Right, that's all being cut. That's all being like done by the the drug traffic. Right, those are the people who have the money. I didn't interview any of these people. I don't know if those were the people who were creating all the pasture, but certainly it's connected. Right, so you can get growth, right, but where you have the criminal organizations, right. Certainly that growth is not going to go back into taxes, right? So I think that's kind of like a robust, an interesting finding, right? But beyond that, there's also the question of just generally who's benefiting, right? So as you accumulate money, if you're basically filtering money into criminal organizations, right, then it's going into things like money laundering, pasture creating and cattle raising, or alternatively getting sent into other things like illegal fishing or gold mining. So I think it's worth thinking about the roles of control in the nature of economic growth and the future of economic growth and the type of society that's ultimately being created through this growth. Which brings me to the second set of questions, which is the role of the state in this process, right? And I think this gets into kind of, I guess, some of the policy directions, some of this debate can go into, right? Because the state's there through all of this, right? It's not that the state is actively promoting coca growing in Putumayo, but there are state actors throughout Putumayo that are constantly engaged with coca growers and with the armed organizations that are promoting coca growing. Whether it's, referring to the FARC in terms of what teachers can teach in which veredas, or asking criminal gangs if they can extend electrification or cell phone service to certain vedetas, right? There's a constant negotiation about these issues. And there are, of course, higher ranking people within the state government who have affiliations with armed groups in the area, people who've been involved in drug trafficking, who've been arrested, things like that. In this way, the state's behaving in a corrupt way, and it's contributing to the illicit markets, right? But the state also has the opportunity, in light of illicit markets, to think about how it can work with coca growers to rebuild markets in such a way so that the state can profit from that, right? So that the value is not being extracted by a handful of people, who are engaged in illicit activities, but to the extent that such markets exist, right, that the value of those markets flows into the hand of the peasant, which actually has been, if you think about it in certain ways, the policies of the era of Bolivia, right? At least in so much the same Thomas Persephone, colleague on the campaign book, has written about it. So I guess there's a lot of interesting things to think about in terms of policy and how that can be used to take these resources and promote growth that's both constructive for the state and constructive for peasants, rather than constructive for organizations.
Great. Mauricio?
Great. So I'm going to use slides.
10 minutes.
Sure. I think you're going to have to stop
Okay.
because otherwise I'm going to go over 10 minutes.
Okay. I'll keep the time.
Just, share screen as it wasn't working.
Right?
Share screen, please.
Yeah, your presentation is at the bottom on the PowerPoint.
Should I show it first?
Yes. Very
This
good.
one?
And then share.
Great.
And now the thing at the bottom. There.
All right. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for asking me to comment this fantastic paper. I did learn a lot. I think Alejandra and her co-authors do a fantastic job in expanding our knowledge. First, taking stock of, as we said, a huge amount of research that has been done over the years in Colombia and abroad on this particular subject. I mean, I have to begin by saying there is perhaps no other issue in the Colombian policy and politics scene that is more relevant than this. So that's why a paper like this gathers a lot of attention, and rightly so, because I think it's an issue that is crucial. And it's becoming crucial not just for Colombia. A week ago, I was at a conference at the IMF, jointly organized with the IDB and the World Bank, on crime in Latin America. And the number of times the issue of drug trafficking was mentioned is just like overwhelming. So I'm going to go through my comments in kind of like reverse order relative to what Maria Alejandra did. She began with like the whole picture, I'm going to talk about your paper, and then hopefully, if I have time, talk about the issues that I think are part of the debate today, and try to connect the two. So, I love papers that challenge conventional wisdom, even if you have worked yourself in trying to establish that conventional wisdom. There's someone who comes and challenges. It's always interesting. And I think what they do is that they challenge the conventional wisdom in at least 3 ways. First, this idea that drug trafficking, drug production, let's say, illicit economies, are beneficial in social and economic terms, at least at the local level. I mean, you make some measurements at the national, like extrapolating at the national level, they're also beneficial, but at least at the local, it's very, the evidence is very robust. 2, illicit economies. Second challenge to conventional wisdom: illicit economies do not generate per se violence. And I would say the third challenge to the conventional wisdom, the one with which I have a harder time, is that illicit economies per se directly do not cause deforestation. That's an interesting point that you make, which is not the production of coca. It is an indirect effect of the production of coca in essentially for cattle. So 3 major kind of like statements here, because a lot of our policy foundation in Colombia has been on the premises that this is bad for the economy, this generates a lot of violence, and it does cause a lot of deforestation. So all the ingredients for a very, at least, provocative paper. I like in the paper the use of, very innovative, the use of exogeneity with this Penny's announcement in 2014, very exogenous announcement out of the blue. No one was expecting it. Interesting. The use of nighttime light data as a proxy for GDP, also very interesting. I mean, not necessarily new, but in this context is also something that adds a lot of information. And the use of instrumental variables, the way you instrument coca production with the probability of being part of the Penny's program, which is in itself a function of crop density before the program was announced, crop density and multidimensional poverty. That's also very interesting. I really think this makes the paper in itself very interesting. I miss, and I think this has a little bit to what you said about your comments, I miss a bit the connection between the illicit economy and state building. I do not know if the results of the paper indicate that this strengthens state capacity, undermines the state capacity. It's like that issue is so crucial, it's left out. Main argument: illicit crops generate liquidity. Easy to see. I mean, you've traveled the country, and we all have seen the street malls. Maybe they don't look as nice, but they're all over. And that liquidity stimulates both. This is the argument: the licit and the illicit economy, right? But then, I mean, when the paper goes at the end and tries to assess the connection between illicit economies or the increase in coca production and taxation, there is no link. There's, like, measuring taxation in many different fronts, there's no link. So that to me puts this idea that the illicit economies actually stimulate the formal economy a little bit on pause, because I'm not 100% sure. You do not test, and you acknowledge that, formal lending. That would be another way of kind of like testing this hypothesis that the illicit economy has this byproduct on the legal economy. But that's kind of like another picture. On the economy, you have the direct effect on coca leaves. That's very straightforward, because you have hectares. That's what you observe. Hectares. You kind of like convert that into leaves. You have a price for the leaves. That's fine. The direct effect, I mean, you can measure that in monetary terms. Then you also have an indirect effect, which is Coca-Based. I mean, you know how to convert coca leaves into Coca-Based. You also have the price of Coca-Based. You don't know exactly where that is taking place. You know where the coca leaves are because you have the satellite information. This you don't necessarily know. It can move from one municipality to another. And then you have the total effect, which is the effect on municipal GDP via the nighttime light data. So this is kind of like the change. And then you see the total effect per municipality, kind of like assuming that the share of that municipality in the department's GDP is essentially the same proportion as the share of that municipality in the nighttime light data of the entire department. By the way, now that I'm talking about this, you should be careful about one thing. This gentleman right here, Juan Carlos Caiza, was the head when I was actually energy minister. He was the head of the program in the government that provided power solutions, energy access to municipalities that are not in the interconnected system. So, you have to control for that because there were investments in bringing access to power. And the most important one, the one that you definitely have to control, is that in 2018, the transmission line that interconnected, the municipalities in Cauca and Nariño that are on the Pacific coast was inaugurated. And that brought access to electricity to those municipalities. I mean, Huapi, Timbiquí, Mosquera, Francisco Pizarro, a really large number of municipalities, all of them part of the PENIS program. And then the aggregate total effect on national GDP is small. Why do I say this is very counterintuitive? Because for years, decades now, a lot of the research has been basically emphasizing the point that illicit drug production in Colombia is counterproductive for the economy, that it has a negative effect on the overall economy of Colombia. 20 years ago, I spent a semester at Harvard. I wrote a paper at that time, kind of like linking the emergence of cocaine production in Colombia when Colombia became a major player in 1980, around 1980, with the beginning of the decline in total factor productivity in Colombia. So that these indirect channels that from coca production through corruption, through judicial congestion, through state capture, through all these channels basically undermined the Colombian economy. It was not good. This was not a net positive for the Colombian economy, it was net negative. So, I mean, you say, well, it has a small positive effect on national GDP. Violence. No evidence that this increasing in the illicit economies, in this case drug production, has any correlation or any causation, or causality with the intensification of the violent presence of armed actors, victimization, or homicide. Here, my only comment is you use, up until 2014, very good data collected by SEDE. After 2014, you use data on the incidence of conflict, violence. That is based on this paper by Osorio, which is text-based measures from narratives collected by CINEP. Recently I used the data on direct observations of, incidents of violence collected by the Defensoría del Pueblo. I just wonder why you go to these more, kind of like indirect measures like text-based. Land use changes. As I said at the beginning, this is the part of the paper that is correct.
So 10 minutes.
I think if proven right, it's going to be a game changer because it's going to put us in a different track in terms of the way we think about deforestation. So far, the conventional wisdom is increases in illicit drug production mean you have to expand the agricultural frontier, then you have to engage in deforestation, and then there is this negative externality associated with the illicit economies. Here you're saying, well, it's not necessarily that, it is the conversion from coca cultivation to pastures. Now that's what's happening. More money comes to the municipality through these, through the illicit economy, and what they do with that money is not to expand illicit crops, is to basically deforest so that you have more land ready for pasture and for cattle. Without necessarily, the interesting thing is that you don't see an increase in the cattle headcount. So it's like you're preparing it for the future. It's land grabbing. So the money from Coca is not directly causing the problem, the environmental problem. It's really these ideas that with that money you grab more land, and I guess in the future you use it for cattle. I'll finish with this. I know I have to finish. I'm going to finish with this. Fast forward this paper, which basically talks about these episodes. You know, the announcement, the peace agreement, and the implementation of it. So clearly, I mean, this is uncontestable. The announcement really caused an increase in coca cultivation. But yeah, I mean, it was implemented, and then we have another episode of increase in significantly. This is a 40% increase, 10% increase last year in area under illicit culture. And think about production. Last report for 2023, 53% increase in production. So this is your episode. Very interesting, but this is a new episode. So what happened now? Because with the implementation of pennies, in theory, this was going to stop, right? Maybe it wasn't implemented. Maybe it didn't have the right incentives. Maybe it did not work. Maybe it was not really the true cause of what had happened. And maybe there's something else. And look at this. Eradication. This is manual eradication. Went up. It's down again. And interdiction is lower, historically low. And I'll end with this idea, which I think it's thought-provoking. I mean, you mention it, and I think it's an underlying force in your paper, but not necessarily at the very explicit level. There's been a transformation in the way the geographical, the spatial economics of illicit drug production in Colombia. There's been a lot of densification, concentration in certain municipalities. So Mocoa, Puerto Asís, Tumaco, El Charco, La Llanera, Timbiquí, Catatumbo, El Tambo. This is high concentration. So, of course, there could be arguments of economies of scale. As you can see, closer to the borders, closer to Ecuador. That's part of the issue. So maybe what we're seeing here at the end of the day is a trend that brings cocaine closer to municipalities that are not really, far away in the distant eastern plateaus of Colombia. These municipalities have access to electricity. These municipalities have access to the ports. These municipalities are not necessarily the poorest of Colombia. But then the dynamics of this business kind of like head in the direction of concentration. And that's part of the reason why we have seen such a huge increase in productivity. And finally, and I'll stop with this, many people will have a hard time with your paper on the violence front, right? Because what we're seeing is the expansion of coca production with the expansion of these, what we call GAOs, Grupos Armados Organizados, organized armed groups. That involves a lot of things that are very different. In this case, this is FARC dissidents, this is the ELN, and this is the self-defenses, the autodefensas gaitanistas de Colombia or Clan del Golfo. So a huge increase in their presence across municipalities. So I'll stop there just by saying, look, the beauty of a paper like this is that the paper has a lot of shades of color, and it makes you think. Policies in Colombia, the shades of color, are much more limited. And in the politics of Colombia, everything is black and white, right? So it's good to inform that conversation with so many colors that you can see in a paper like this. That's it. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Maybe 2-3 minutes, we can answer some of these issues and then,
I don't know if I'm gonna answer, I'm gonna just react,
okay, react and then we open to the audience.
but I wanna. But but then we are not.
Okay, let's try to answer one.
No,
Or do you want me to-
I need the.
So shall I take a few more questions when you do this?
So, quick reaction,
I'm gonna.
I knew that the
I wanna
Minister
see.
of Mine was gonna be commenting, so I have my other extra mouth about about the energy generation project. So we did control, we have fixed effects at the municipal and department level, so that should be controlling there. But this is the data that we have access for, and these are the energy generation projects in Colombia between the periods that we're analyzing, 2014 and 2019. And you can see that, I mean, there are some in the municipalities where the boom happened, but most of the generation projects are not there. So this is not because of the new generation project. And actually, I don't think this is because of public services. Maybe it's actually people just buying their own homes and putting up their own lights at their homes. So this is, I'm pretty confident that it's that. And we are controlling with fixed effect at the municipality and the department level. But it's a good point, and that's why I closed my mouth just in case. The other thing, Mauricio, we are not the first. I hope I was the first, but we were not the first saying this discussion about deforestation. I think there's already a lot of evidence in the paper showing that, in the literature showing that coca crops evolve an indirect effect, generating deforestation rather than direct effect. So I think there is already a lot of evidence showing that in different periods of time. However, I agree with you, Desmond, that I am talking about a particular period of time. And it is true, and that's why people in Colombia could not extrapolate my paper to what is happening now. I want to show you the data about the violence. It is true that we are in a period of time in Colombia that the FARC were demobilizing. So it is a moment of time in Colombia that basically all indicators, except the social leader killings, were going down, and except confinamientos. So these two are going up, but the rest of other indicators are going down. So I do think that we're in a period of time in which it was a very particular moment. And a moment that we haven't understood completely. And I think what we are happening right now is that other groups taking over the business and taking over the boom because the state didn't arrive. So that's why when I showed the results on violence, I said we didn't find any effect in that period. But I think that we can discuss, not in the paper, but in futurology, if this boom is also feeding or fueling the conflict now because the FARC left and the state didn't arrive. And that brings me to the other question that I think is very important, Desmond, and I agree that's the sort of the black box that we have in the paper, and it's who is benefit from the growth. Because certainly it's not the cocaderos. I already showed that they are not moving out of poverty. There's evidence of liquidity. There are a lot of restaurants, a lot of stores, a lot of businesses around, but we don't know how this boom is distributed because also there are people getting a bigger share of that boom, and we don't know. We have, for example, access lately to some of the financial data, like the deposits, credits, but that's again the formal economy. And my intuition is that it's a growth, but it's a very informal growth. That's why it's not translated in the state capacity. So this paper is awful for people who are thinking about like clear answers. There's a lot of contradiction in my results, but it's the territorial effect of the illicit economy. That is yes, bad, good, positive. So I think that the long-term effects of this boom, probably we're gonna see it at this time when the market is getting organized by the new actors and we start to understand who is getting part of that game. Actually, pastors are not necessarily that the cocalero are transforming their coca to pastors. You know, we don't know if the pastors are from the illegal armed groups, from the owner of the store,
Can you
from the
stop sharing
restaurant.
so that people can see?
Which people?
When they film, not
Okay.
filming.
I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah. About the role of the FARC, what we did in the paper is to see if this effect is happening in FARC municipalities and non-FARC municipalities, and we found that the effect is in both cases, but it's higher in FARC municipalities, of course, because FARC are more important in regulating this market. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned about the effect of the school, and I think we have to do the same sort of heterogeneous effect and looking at the effect of the food in FARC municipalities and again, so you have a very good point to see what is the FARC, what is the role of the FARC there. I don't know, I think
Shall we take a few questions
Yeah,
from the audience?
yeah.
Okay. Molly? Okay, Julian?
Yeah, thanks for this great presentation. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I just have a theoretical question and then an empirical one. So I'll start with like maybe the bigger picture theoretical question. I think like the way that you framed the paper about sort of like this interplay between illicit and licit economies and stuff is really interesting. But I wonder how much of the story here is unique to coca, right? So you talked about it as, you know, sort of being this like very unique crop, right? Like the harvest can happen 4 times a year and compared to other things, right? So would you expect to see similar dynamics from booms in other illicit economies, right? So just to speak a little bit about my experience with some of these municipalities, like I visited municipalities that also have a lot of illegal mining. And in that case, any of the revenue that they have for mining doesn't accord with all these kind of like nice social benefits. I think partially because the revenue there is very irregular. You get like, you know, nothing for months and then you get something great. And so at least, you know, in my experience, the people I spoke with told me that they weren't necessarily investing it in these longer term things. Whereas like coca has like this like really remarkable stability. So I guess that's the theoretical question, right? If this is just sort of like unique to the income stability of coca. And then the empirical question that I had was just sort of about because you have like a lot of like different like placebo tests, and I really like all of the empirics throughout, but I was left wondering when you do things like, for example, like look at sort of like FARC versus non-FARC municipalities for the effects. I wonder if part of what's going on with like some of the nulls for violence or things like that, are they just nulls, or are they, for example, that like parallel trends isn't being fulfilled for violence, right? Because I kind of buy that like nighttime lights could be sort of like parallel across these two different types of municipalities, but maybe a little bit less for some of these other indicators. So I think sort of like, and I could have missed it in the paper, I might have just missed it, but I think showing the same sort of like dynamic specification you have for nighttime lights for some of these violence indicators would be great to sort of disentangle whether it's just that some of these assumptions maybe aren't there, or if truly, you know, everything looks fine and it is a true null.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Yeah. I mean, good question about the gold. You know that I've been studying this revolving door between gold and coca, and I think it's not working quite the same. I mean, in the last year that there was a crisis in the coca market, gold didn't replace it. So I think because of the reason that you said that gold is not, we're not talking about the same amount, and it's more difficult to find, etc. It's not gonna work the same. But I think it's relevant for other illegal plants. Marijuana, cannabis work the same, amapola as well. So let's say that this is speak about the impact of illegal plant booms, not really gold. I think gold it's different. Also because gold becomes legal once it's in the market. So I think, yeah, they don't function the same. Yeah, I think very well, good point about showing the parallel trends of all the other data to show causality. As I mentioned before, everything is the same except for the last data on education, because for that we only have 2 points. So in all of the other data, we are really claiming causality. With education, we are like, it's good intuition, but it's not quite causality. And that's bring me, I forgot about other question about the data that we're using. We're using about the Osorio data set. It's because they have this at the grid level. So we can have the other data that you mentioned is only at the municipality level. So here we need the data at the grid level, and that's only available with this Osorio data. Although we have tried some tests with the municipal data that the sede has in Bogotá, and it was fine. Thank you, William.
Any other question? Yes, Maria Jose?
I have a question both for Maria Alejandra and Mauricio. We have been here in the past month, more recently, President Petro saying that he has a project to buy the coca leaves directly from cocaleros. How do you think that this announcement and this potential project could, how do you think that your paper could inform this policy, and how can we analyze this policy and the potential downsides of the policy or upsides?
Yeah. My paper informed that in the way that they haven't learned about the past experience of the announcement of the substitution program. So I'm sure that today they are planting more coca in those regions that he said that they were going to buy the coca. So it was a very unplanned announcement that is going to generate, again, unintended consequences. That's one thing. The other thing is that we don't know what they're going to do with the coca. So the 253,000 hectares on the cocaine market, there's no way that we can use that for alternative markets. We will have to drink tea and eat almohadas 24 hours every day. Plus, that coca, it has been produced with a lot of agrochemicals, so it cannot be used for food. So for now, the paper informed that is going to be probably an unintended consequence again, and they're going to increase the amount of coca in that area. I think it was a very bad idea.
Mauricio, you want to add something?
I would just add, agreeing with what Maria Alejandra said, that the difference between this announcement and the Venice announcement is that Venice was credible. It was a credible announcement, whereas this is not a credible announcement.
That's true.
And therefore, I don't think it's going to trigger the type of response that was the case with the. That's my point number one. Point number two, it's kind of like expanding a bit on your question, which is, what are then the policy options? I mean, how can we use this paper to inform the policy options in Colombia? Many people would say, well, this is basically something that that Colombia should use to basically say to the world, look, enough is enough. The war on drugs has been nonsense. But if we keep just doing that, nothing is going to change. So I think we have to inform policy with the assumption, and I think it's a realistic assumption, that nothing is going to happen at the global level. So what are our best options? I'd say with a paper like this, what are our best options? And I think that is a very interesting direction of the conversation. It's not buying the coca, by the way. I don't think it's buying the coca.
Any other comment or question? Manuela?
I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance to read the paper, but I'm just curious from sort of everyone then, with the time trends that suggest this marked change, which from my perspective, I was thinking, oh, well, there's a pandemic and things went down and then goes way up, but I didn't know if some of this was sort of making up for lost time, or all of a sudden now it's easier to get back to reaching your markets, but that's just, from my particular tinted lenses, that's the first thing I saw. But I'm wondering, with the trends the way they're going now, I know you already said like that was a particular moment in time, but how do you see with the increases now, like, how does one sort of account, or how does one use the knowledge from your work for understanding what to expect given these increasing trends?
Well, I think that what my paper highlights is that you cannot just say, I'm going to eradicate the coca crops. And that's it, because the coca crops represent, even though we have to discuss who's getting the benefits, but it's representing between 2 and 10% of the GDP of those municipalities. So we have to think harder about how to replace that economy if possible. Two, I think that these papers talk about the unintended effects of the drug policies. And three, we have to think about harder about what interventions will work when you have 23 million of consumers. I mean, that's the only thing that we know for sure. And that's lower bound, 23 million of consumers in the lower bound. So we are against a very difficult market with a lot of consequences at the local level. So I think that as Mauricio was saying, we have to, but it's still illegal. It's not going to be regulated in the next couple of years. We're not going to see, this generation is not going to see that regulated. So what are we going to do? And I think you can think about solutions at some places. And you could aim for that. I just saw a paper this morning showing the effect of formalizing land and roads reduces the coca crops in those areas that have both conditions. But if you only formalize land and you only have roads, you are not able to reduce. But then I asked the authors, and did you check if coca were displayed elsewhere? And they were like, no, our paper doesn't show that, which is okay. Like man, I only look at this. And I think that coca is gonna move next door.
Maria Alejandra, I think this brings me to a question that both of the discussions mentioned and you didn't really tackle, which is a state presence. All of your indicators really, I mean, what the opportunistic behavior you show has been shown for other policies in Colombia. There is this paper by Alicia Holland on the moment they announce a road, everybody builds a home in the trace of the road so that the state would have to pay them to vacate the land for the road, right? So it's very, but it really tells us that the state is completely absent. And the only way of getting state services or something from the state is basically this trolling, this opportunistic behavior. And it's interesting that you said these are areas where it's more likely to have of course, a DTO, a drug trafficking organization, which probably charges taxes or extortion to the local people. So yes, they're not paying taxes because they are paying taxes, just not to the state. And there's no services, water or sewage or only electricity, which is something that maybe even the drug traffic organization invested in because they need it for the trade. And they have a monopoly because basically they go buy every time they go buy from you, it's usually you get a bad price. And so there is no state, which is common with other areas. The contrast, I think, with Bolivia was well taken because in the Chapare, there's no state, but there is the Cocaleros Union, right? Whereas here, there's no state, there's only the DTOs. So, I mean, the idea of welfare that not only does not explain distribution, but also is dependent on the state withdrawing seems a little odd.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we beyond taxes, we haven't included any measurement about state.
Well, you have the fact that there are groups, meaning that the state has surrendered the monopoly, legitimate monopoly of force, and you have social services that are not there, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is not a paper about state formation or state capacity. I think it has implications for it.
Well, but the alternative public policy would be to bring the state.
Yeah.
With the roads, with cadasters, with social services. Sure. I mean, this is the state withdrawing and giving the armed groups development policy, basically.
Yeah. Of course, some people would argue that the state has been there, but it has been in a different form and without benefiting some of the people. Like, I mean, that could be another paper, but there is a lot of credits for cattle ranching in those places, for example. So we will have to be more precise about what type of state we want to measure in order to make the point. But for sure, this paper is talking about the growth of an economy in the absence of the state. The state is not driven this growth, and that's for sure. But the only thing that we mentioned is, which I think is really important, is that the only way that the state could fund public goods is by tax collection, and they are not collecting taxes in this area. So I think that's definitely a negative one. I mean, we will have to think about how to bring the state into the discussion of this paper without really measuring the capacity. I mean, that is very important, but we are not entering that road. But I do think that the paper that I mentioned this morning from my colleagues, Eva Martinez and Ana Lopez, I think that the role of roads, in my experience, for these communities are very important, and it's one of the forms that the state is present. But the FARC has historically also built roads. So we have to sort of have a more nuanced discussion about what is a state. It's building schools, justice, the army there, the monopoly of the forest, like, and this paper is not going into that direction. But it's important. There was another.
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to make a quick comment on Professor Cardenas. What you mentioned after the substitution program, there was this spike in coca growing. I saw it was confined between 2019 and 2022. Perhaps one of the factors could have been the pandemic and the economic effect in Colombia. I am not very familiar on what kind of economic effect it was, but I'm assuming a bit of a downturn could have led the farmers to go back to more profitable crops.
But I think your graph was about the growth, not the
growth.
It was the growth, not the hectares, because the hectare has been increasing always.
Oh,
With
okay.
other funds, yeah.
Yeah, but growth is very revealing because, as you rightly say, it means that something else happened that we need to explain. I mean, we need to do another paper. But let me suggest some hypotheses. One is that the NIS ultimately was not implemented or was very poorly implemented. So it did not actually materialize into providing really the alternative that many of these coca producers want. Two, there was less effort in terms of eradication. So there was no carrot, but there was also no stick. And so that probably has an effect. And finally, and this is kind of like you said the revolving door. The revolving door is that this brings in more armed groups, and the armed groups want to expand. They get money from and they're funded by this illicit trade, and therefore they have more capacity to expand. So that is a little bit of what I think would be the explanation underlying what happened in the last, say, 3 years. Pandemic or not, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, I know consumption did increase, world consumption did increase, but was that the main driver of what happened in Colombia? I'm not 100% sure. But that's another paper, and it's going to be a very interesting paper to write.
Well, it's 5, and this is a very, very interesting paper. Thank you so much, Alejandra.